Hello, beautiful community. This is a video about probably the most emotionally painful thing in my life. And I'm conflicted about whether to put it on the philosophy channel, the tiny philosophy channel, because it's a video about being a philosopher, or to put it on the chat channel where I probably think I'll put it. So hi. Because it's your interest and also your right to know some of what's going on in my mind behind my hat as a public intellectual. And you know that what you see is completely real, right? I don't have a public persona. You speaking to me or you listening to me is just like me speaking to my closest friend in the kitchen or from my bed. But nevertheless, there's a difference between public intellectual stuff and just intellectual stuff. I want to talk to you about that. So let's do it. Why don't I just say what I think is the biggest problem that I have? And then I'll say what I have done to adjust, the ways I've adjusted really well. And then I'll just probably say what I want, right? What my dream is. And you know, dreams are very important because when we care about other human beings, we want for them what they want for themselves, and we also love them for the way they want things for themselves. So this idea of what does someone I care about want is a very important relational human idea. So my problem is that there's nothing wrong with me, and I'm a hypochondriac. I'm pretending to be ill. And I am just in bed all the time. Unfortunately, I'm joking. So you know that 20 years ago, I got ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis. And you also know that about 6 months ago, I got some post-COVID stuff on top of that. So I've got a kind of a double layer of life-altering illness. Let me tell you how it started. And let me tell you what the kind of the big conflict is, which is just me being a philosopher who can't do philosophy much at the moment. And I'll say something about nice adjustments I've made, and I'll tell you my dream. Okay. So 22 years ago, I am a postgraduate at Oxford in the UK. And I'm sitting around in Nuffield College in a seminar, and somebody says something that I want to respond to, and I realize that I can't. And then I realize that even though what they've said is the sort of thing I'd expect them to say, something I'm very familiar with, I can't understand what they've said. That was the political philosopher David Miller, and I wanted to tell him something, to say something in response to him about the wonderful political philosopher John Rawls. But I couldn't. Then somebody said this on my behalf. I couldn't understand what they said either. And whoa, right? Everything changed because I realized something was going wrong neurologically that was far beyond a flu. And what's interesting is that I was completely physically well at that point. So I was having some quite significant eye symptoms, but they didn't really affect my physical functioning. And then this kind of neuro stuff happened while I was completely well. But it was so extreme, almost like having a stroke, that I immediately realized something really big had changed. And I had this sort of real sense of departure from the world, because I was trying to sort of claw back my brain as it was, and I couldn't. There's a passage in Beethoven's 26th piano sonata where you are chasing an object into the distance and the object disappears around the corner, and then your chasing of it itself disappears around the corner, and then you just let go of the idea of trying to catch back something that's outside of your grasp. And that's how I felt. And then because I was perfectly physically well, I could have in fact gone for a jog at that point. I walked from where I was in this seminar in Nuffield College in Oxford to my college, which was Christchurch. It's about a 10 plus minute walk. And on that walk, when I was feeling perfectly well physically, I reflected that something was going wrong that was quite disconcerting. And within a few weeks of that, I couldn't speak. I couldn't read a paragraph in a tabloid newspaper and comprehend it. And I couldn't walk. And that was the case for a couple of years until I began to remain disabled but get better. And so what's so extreme about that very moment, right, is if you're a philosopher being betrayed by your brain while still, even though it was only for a few weeks, remaining physically able to walk around and do stuff. It's very strange that this story begins, as it does for a lot of people, quite frankly. It's a part of neurological illness, which is really triggered by a combination of genetics plus external triggering events, which in my case was both a virus and an infection that I caught at the same time in Oxford. But what this led to was that I ended up in a situation where I was most of the hours of the day too ill to do philosophy. And this is really the obstacle that I want to talk about first, right? The obstacle I haven't solved, and I'll talk about what I have adjusted to and solved very well. So eventually, a few years later, I returned to a part-time, which was really an eighth-time PhD. But I persisted in this situation where I could only work an hour or 2 or 3 a day. And that never really changed much over 20 years. It was just volatile. And now, of course, this thing I'm complaining about is, while still the primary source of pain in my life, it's a bit secondary because I've got this post-COVID story since August. And that has reduced my 3 hours of work a day to 1 hour, and from bed. And my capacity to sit up like this is probably about half an hour per day. And so now I'm more worried about more immediate things, like not having extreme health moments where I need to go to hospital, and just getting through the days and doing the minor reconnects with my beautiful community as a public intellectual, and that's it. So I'm actually not right now, these weeks, these months, lying around thinking, oh my word, I'm a philosopher who can't do philosophy all the time. But in the background, that still probably is the biggest challenge in my life. And what I haven't worked out here is simply time. Because if I'm sitting here right now, I'm not feeling well right now, but I could do a bit of philosophy right now. The problem is that this right now only lasts a very small fraction of my day. And I suppose I could do philosophy instead of being a public intellectual, but then, quite frankly, that just wouldn't give me enough time either. And it's actually easier to be a public intellectual in a short time window than it is to be a philosopher. So there is no question of me reducing my public intellectual work to be a philosopher. But it's just a question of how do I find more time in the day, and how do I find more functioning? And of course, my team of doctors is trying to do everything they can about this. But that's the key obstacle that I'm facing at the moment in my life. That's time. I don't have enough hours in the day to do philosophy while I am a philosopher psychologically. But let me tell you a little bit about what I did manage to adjust to very well, and actually very quickly. And a lot of it is just infantile stuff. So before I got sick, I was perfectly healthy, sort of 2003 and earlier. I couldn't really lose an argument in public. In other words, it wasn't really conceivable that somebody, no matter how smart and intelligent, could say something to which I wouldn't have an immediate and sophisticated response. And so that wasn't much a part of my identity, because I don't really think being quick or charismatic in public is central to being a philosopher. A lot of philosophers, sit around and can barely make a coherent sound for 5 minutes and then they say something. But nevertheless, that was a feature for me that obviously I permanently lost with illness. And I adjusted very, very quickly to it. But actually, before I adjusted to it, it was painful. I remember doing a talk during my PhD period, being asked some questions from the audience and being unable to answer, and having to answer them by email a day later. And I found that I was a kid, right? I was just doing my PhD. It'd been my worst, sickest period was over. Well, for a while at least. Then I had a relapse. But I was asked some questions, couldn't answer them on the spot, which is a completely unprecedented feeling for me. I couldn't answer them because of brain inflammation. And I had to respond. And I felt incredibly emotionally pained by that. I felt like it was a real attack on my identity. Then I adjusted. There are certain things that I never do as of 2003. I never say, as I used to often, there are 5 important considerations around the point you've made. And here they go. And number 5 is when I arrive at minute 8 of my commentary. I never do that. I always say just 1 or 2 at a time. My speech is much slower, and I now spend probably 80% of my energy while speaking, focusing on keeping on speaking rather than on the points I'm making. And what happened within a couple of years of sort of coming back into the world, quarter time, if you like, after that really period of illness, first few years of illness where I couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't read, is that I let that go completely. And another thing I never really had to deal with was imposter syndrome, right? Being a philosopher and not participating in the way that I would like, not producing, right, philosophical work. And that's because I am so clearly a philosopher psychologically that if I'm not a philosopher, nobody is, right? If I'm not a philosopher, Alistair McIntyre isn't a philosopher. Because of the psychological traits I have that are so laughably the traits a philosopher might have, that I never have this sense of imposter, because being very, very fully confident, I am philosophy. I'm fully confident, and I recognize that psychologically I am philosophy. So I would not in any way be more of a philosopher if I pressed a button and my illness disappeared and I had, a chair in philosophy tomorrow. So I think that wasn't a problem. And of course, because of the confidence, envy and jealousy were never a problem, right? I'm always incredibly happy when philosophers of the younger generation are doing, nice things, and I'm not. I'm just really happy to see it. And one of the happiest things for me is actually when somebody does a fairly good effort at what I would have done had I been well but didn't. So the idea that there are some gaps that really need to be filled by me, but then suddenly somebody else comes and begins filling them, that's an enormous source of almost physical relief for me. So the only thing I would say to that is that actually we sometimes give envy a bad name. Jealousy is bad. Envy can be good or bad, and there is actually a kind of envy that is conducive to growth that I don't think is bad. That is very much wanting to be in the position of someone who is in a position that you want to be in but can't, and wanting to really enjoy that and flourish, and then these feelings sitting in you in a constructive way and being conducive to growth. So some envy is bad, some envy is good. So that's what I really struggle with philosophy, and what is the most emotionally painful thing in my life, which roughly just works at functional time, insufficient functional time. Right, the fact that I wasn't feeling well when I began this video, and I'm already quite a bit less well than I was 15 minutes ago just through doing this video. And then the various ways I have adjusted or I didn't even need to adjust. Well, let me tell you my dream, which isn't complex in respect of philosophy, because I can do philosophy now, I just don't have enough breadth of time to do it. So my dream is A, that my health stop deteriorating, B, that I don't die too prematurely, to give myself time to write, let's say, 2 philosophy books. That happens. Incredible. And then the other dream is that I somehow find magical ways of being able to do more in very, very limited time. I'm always dancing with that. I'm always exploring that. And so another dream is just to have more solutions where so far I can't quite see them. Because yes, if you're physically too ill, that's a hard stop. That's a hard limit. But within the limited functional time you have, there's always the possibility to be surprised about how much you can do, because human beings are limitlessly industrious and inventive. So lots of love. Oh, and the way to the dream practically, I just want to spend 30 seconds on that. So my practical way to the dream is to continue making our conversation sustainable, and then use our conversation to make not just our conversation, but also my philosophical work sustainable. And that will make my conversation with you even richer, I think, because even if I don't directly talk about my philosophy output with us here on chat, it'll still dramatically enrich our chat experience, because quite frankly, my planned published philosophical work is about the same damn topics. It's just from the vantage point of a slightly different interest. And practically, it means that I just want to keep deepening our conversation and also increase the elements of it that are making it sustainable. So at the moment, for instance, I'm doing 0 to 4 hours of my special boutique consulting service a month, which are tiny hours. And let's say in 2025, I'm aiming to increase that, let's say from 0 to 4 to 0 to 8 hours. So making little moves like that might make not just us here sustainable, but might make us plus the philosophy sustainable, and they can both encourage each other and spur each other on, these two hats, in a sort of win-win kind of way. Beautiful community. Lots of love.